I'm here today with the fabulous Janice Fiamengo, who's a professor of English at the University of Ottawa, and she's very actively involved in speaking out about men's rights. Janice has just made her 100th video in her YouTube series, which is called the Fiamengo Files. And she's the author of a collection of essays called Sons of Feminism, where men wrote about living in our feminist society. Janice is incredibly brave, articulate, and scholarly, nailing the issues in her usual calm, incisive manner. I've been following her for years now and delighted to finally connect with her today. We've tried before and had real internet problems. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you very much, Bettina. I hope we don't have internet problems again. We'll see. And I would like to apologize to begin with that my connection is so bad.
Oh, that's right. I'm sure it's not your problem. Obviously, parts of the country struggle with this, here in Australia as well. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to do is start off showing some of the footage of us both under attack on college campuses for challenging the feminist orthodoxy. I think it's really funny that we've had such similar experiences on other sides of the world.
I like to call her Janice Flamingo. She's a rape apologist.
Janice Flamingo's got to go. Hey, hey. Oh, oh.
Yes means yes. No means no. Bettina and has got to go. Yes means yes. No means no.
That one here. My hope that as a result of my talk, a few of you may decide to... Okay, you know, it's the signature... It's the signature of a totalitarian ideology to attempt to quash dissent. So every time you interrupt, you're merely showing your repressive tendencies. You're not showing anything about your virtue.
Rape is rightly a criminal offence and should be treated very seriously. The accused might use to defend himself and really putting him at jeopardy of wrongful conviction.
Yes, well, they make me out to be much more powerful and much more dangerous than I actually am, I think. It's quite something. And of course, you know, in fact, I don't think I would have become as involved, at least not as quickly, if it hadn't been for the fact that these protesting types came out en masse to demonstrate against Warren Farrell in the fall of 2012. That was really my introduction to the climate on university campuses in which it is not even possible for men, young and old, to discuss with a very moderate person such as Warren Farrell the issues facing boys and men today. And it was when I saw that Steve had gone to the University of Toronto in the fall of 2012 when Warren Farrell spoke there, and he filmed the virulent, vicious, absolutely hysterical anti-Farrell protests there. And that was when I first decided, if this is what it's like to try to talk about men's issues, then I'm going to start talking about how ridiculous it is that men can't discuss their lives on a university campus without this kind of blowback.
Janice, you were working as an academic in the university, and you were on various committees promoting, making decisions about who would be promoted and who would get which jobs. And you noticed women were getting all the jobs, and that's one of the things that alerted you to what's going on here. Can you tell me about that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that was my introduction to what the great movement for gender equality really boils down to. And I knew this before. When I was applying for jobs in the late 1990s, it was obvious to me that there was a push to hire women. And that meant that when I was shortlisted, and for anybody not in academia, the way it works is that usually there's a short list of 3 or 4 candidates who are brought in for a full day interview. And when I was first on the job market, I was shortlisted at the University of Saskatchewan and at the University of Ottawa. And in both cases, there was not a single man on those shortlists. I saw this happening even more overtly once I was actually on the other side of the hiring process. I couldn't help but see that although the rhetoric is that it's equity hiring, which means that if you have two candidates of equal worth, you would choose the one that would allow the university to fulfill its equity mandate.
Yeah.
So first, you're supposed to be considering the qualities of the candidate. And then only when you have two equally qualified candidates would you choose the woman or the visible minority or what have you. But in fact, everybody knows that once you're in that mindset that you're determined to fulfill the goals of the university, and there's all sorts of pressure from on high. And in fact, if you do hire a white man, in some cases, the head of the department has to write a letter explaining why the white man was hired and not various other candidates. So the pressure on these people, many of whom are social justice minded anyway, so they're quite happy to prove to themselves and everyone else what wonderful people they are by hiring the particular candidates. And I saw that all sorts of clearly superior qualified men were being passed over in favor of women with the most ridiculous of excuses offered. People would be saying things like, well, it's true that this male candidate has written 2 books in the areas of Renaissance drama, which is the area we want to hire in. He's written 2 books and all sorts of articles and has presented conference papers and has taught for 5 years and all these things. But here's this candidate, and she's written 1 paper on women travelers during, the 16th century. And I find it very cutting edge and very interesting. And I think this woman's work will really interest our students, and it allows us to offer something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to offer. And this man's 2 books published with Cambridge University Press are really rather conventional and really aren't doing anything particularly bold or innovative. So, just outright lies in order to pretend to everybody that we weren't doing what we were doing, which was simply hiring women because they were women.
Did you try to speak out on those committees, and what happened?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I did. And, in general, people would come to me and say, oh, I was really glad you said that. They would come to me and say that after the meeting.
But you were presumably outnumbered.
Yeah, I was outnumbered. Most people would say, they would downplay, they would poo-poo my concerns. There was one woman in particular in the department that I worked for who came to me privately to tell me, she seemed to think that I was under the impression that, she came to tell me that women had had a terrible experience. She came to tell me that when she was studying English literature as a young woman, all the authors that were studied were male, and that this was so terrible, such an awful, traumatic experience. So she clearly thought that if she simply convinced me that she and other women had suffered so terribly, that I would come on board and realize. She seemed to think I was terribly naive and very malleable. And that was the general impression.
Yeah. Janice, I know since then you've had contact with people in Australia and in Australia academia as well. Your impression is the same thing's happening here, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And when I'm talking about 1998, 1999. So now here we are 20 years later. That was going on throughout the 1990s. Now we have, as you know, in Australia, there are often women-only positions. So the pretense that men have any opportunity at all isn't any longer even maintained. Now, there's just out and out discrimination with, I think it was the University of Melbourne, the mathematics department a couple of years ago hired 3 women-only positions in mathematics. I'm in contact with a man, an astrophysicist, who was at an Australian university for many years and finally left and went to China because he realized he was never going to get a permanent position. Physics right now, physics departments in Australia are so keen to demonstrate their feminist bona fides that it's simply nearly impossible for a man, no matter what kind of record he has, to be hired. And I just find this outrageous, let alone the effect this is going to have on the development of science all across the Western world. They're not worrying about this in China. China is moving ahead, as are other Asian countries. But the impact on men, and this man in particular has written to me saying he knows so many very bright young physicists who have simply left academia altogether in disgust. The sense of resentment, the anger, the awareness that your own society doesn't want to give you the chance to use your gifts and to compete on an equal playing field, it's tremendous. And all the while this is going on, when you see women being hired, being getting advances, being put into positions of great influence, being promoted, above you. You see all this going on. That's bad enough in itself. It's terrible. But even while this is going on, you still have to confess your white male privilege. You still have to hear all the time about, well, how awful it is to be a woman in physics. It's outrageous.
It is outrageous. One of the things you've highlighted in a lot of your YouTube videos is examples of white men, particularly, being taken down, being forced out of their jobs in academic jobs across the world, targeted, part of the Me Too movement, particularly now, but also, spurious accusations about their academic work, whatever. Can you give me some of your favorite, or I suppose most horrendous examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, this could be the whole subject of an hour-long discussion so easily. It's I think one of the most terrifying features of our present age, that every single man in a university position, of course any man in any position of power, knows that he is just one accusation away from career and reputational ruin. And there are so many outrageous cases, some of which the man actually perhaps did what he has been accused of doing. And often the accusations are of such minor transgressions against propriety. There's a case that I did a video about not too long ago, and this has been ongoing for years. This is a fellow at a Canadian university, Brock University in Ontario, not a particularly prestigious place, but perfectly okay university. This man was an esteemed historian, a historian of modern warfare. His name is Schimmelpenninck, and he, 4 years ago, was accused of sexual harassment. Now, he originally denied the charge altogether. Later on, he apologized. So it's really not clear whether he did what it's claimed that he did. He said that he actually couldn't remember, but let's accept that he did this thing. This is what it boiled down to. He went out drinking with some of his students, all of whom were of legal drinking age, after one of his classes. After the bar closed, they went back, a number of them, a man and a woman student, went back with him to his office to continue their conversation. At one point, the male student left and the female student stayed on. At this point, he apparently moved to sit beside her, touched her physically, and the report said that he engaged in an inappropriate physical touch. I thought it was very interesting that it didn't say sexual, and he's never been charged with sexual assault. And in Canada, nearly anything, any kind of sexual touching can be considered sexual assault. So I'm assuming this was something minor enough that neither the student nor the university considered it sexual assault, but he touched her.
Below the knee or above the neck or something.
Maybe he brushed her hair out of her face, or something very minor. This was not a sexual assault. He touched her and he expressed some kind of romantic / sexual interest. That was it. Presumably, I don't know what happened exactly, but she left the office at that point. He did not try to force himself on her, anything like that. For that, he was investigated. He was suspended for a number of years, And there was an attempt in January of this year, and all of this happened in the fall of 2014. The investigation took place over the next year or so. From 2016 to today, he has not been back in the classroom. In January of 2019, there was an attempt made to bring him back into the classroom. He was going to teach one class. He'd had to take a course on, respectful workplace conduct. He was under very strict conditions about how he could interact with students, all that sort of thing. He offered a public apology, but that wasn't good enough. The students demonstrated. They set up a information booth. They claimed that he was a violent man, that he'd committed an act of sexual violence, and they made such a fuss that the university canceled his course, and it's now unclear what's going to happen. I assume that he will be retired. So this is the end of him, and he's considered, some sort of sex criminal, when in fact what he did was a minor transgression.
I mean, it is just so appalling. And I suppose what makes me cringe is that women are showing themselves in the worst possible light. I mean, we are behaving as vindictive, mean, malevolent creatures, and no one dares call this out. I mean, it just makes me, I don't know how you feel. I feel so ashamed of my gender. Yeah.
I remember you saying that in an interview, and I just thought, exactly, that's exactly it. When I used to study, that was one of my subject areas when I was a graduate student. My dissertation was on 19th century Canadian journalists and public figures, female journalists and public figures. And, this is the era of the suffrage movement and discussion about women's education and women being more involved in public life. And, a number of anti-feminist commentators came forward at that time. And their arguments were that although there might be individual women who were highly qualified, highly intelligent, who had much to offer public life, that in general, it was a bad idea for women to become engaged in public life, because women lacked a certain kind of deep, ability to control their emotions, that women were more fragile emotionally and mentally, that women took things too personally. They made these kinds of arguments. Of course, I laughed at them and scorned them and wrote against them when I was doing my dissertation. And now I find, to my absolute horror and shame, that much of women's behavior over the past 20 years actually seems to bear out some of that criticism. That there seems to be now, I don't know what to call, whether this is a form of mass hysteria, or whether it is actually a kind of unconscious recognition on women's part that women can't handle sexual freedom, that women aren't autonomous agents, that women can't take responsibility for their own lives. I don't know what it is, but I'm forced to sort of agree with these anti-feminist commentators that something goes terribly wrong when women are given this kind of power, that they're not able to exercise power responsibly. I would like to be proved wrong.
You see, I would always say that's a minority of women. I don't think most women are like that. I think most women like us are cringing at what's happening and the way women are behaving. But the majority of women, I would like to think, are still sensible, like men, find it appalling what's happening to men, and yet they've been silenced. I mean, that's my constant thought. How do I engage ordinary women in what's happening here and get us to speak out and denounce the behavior of these other women and restore our reputations as decent human beings? I mean, we have to do this. I had a letter this week from a guy who was in a newsagent and he was buying my book, my new book, and a woman in her 40s standing near him said, "Oh, you're not buying that crap, are you?" And an older woman leapt in and said, it's women like you that make that book needed, and I'm buying it for my grandsons, which I thought was a lovely story. But I still have some faith, because everywhere I go, I live at still a very pretty public life. I'm out speaking a lot, and ordinary women come up to me all the time saying they applaud what I'm doing. And they too are cringing at the way this small group of women is behaving, particularly some of these powerful women. And I'd like to think we can harness that good sense is still out there in the majority of women. I have to believe in that. But it is just shocking. Now, I want to talk about a few more other issues, Janice. I know you know a lot about what's being taught in the women's studies programs at the universities. Can you tell me about the lack of scholarship, the lack of evidence in those courses?
Well, you know as well as I that these courses, they are activist programs. Their primary aim is to advance feminist ideology. That's what they are. They're the academic arm of the radical feminist movement. And so we aren't interested in actual research in terms of looking at a subject from a variety of points of view and following the evidence where the evidence leads. They start with a number of fundamental platforms and patriarchal power, the idea that men are violent, men are abusive because they are privileged. Their entire understanding of both sexual and physical violence is that it springs from a sense of male entitlement. So all the research out there that suggests that violence is a result of intergenerational family violence, that abuse springs from mental health problems or from addiction issues or because somebody was himself abused as a child. All of that is ignored in favor of patriarchy theory. All of the myths that you've worked so hard to debunk. 1 in 4 women being sexually assaulted in her life, or now it's 1 in 3, even in some cases. All of these are put forward and reinforced in these programs. And it's not only these programs now. I mean, that's where it all started in the 1980s. But now those ideas have invaded every other discipline that exists across the entire university. You find this now in the social sciences, certainly, and the humanities. You find it invading the hard sciences. We've got all sorts of now ideas about how feminists will do science, the natural sciences differently. It is stunning. And just to go back to your previous point about having faith in women. I mean, I'm really interested in that, actually, because of course, I too get messages from women all the time saying, go girl, and who are also women who are also appalled by the terrible way that men are being treated. But when I look around the universities, what I see is an incredible uniformity amongst female academics. And this is thousands and thousands of women who live the most privileged lives that human beings have ever lived in the history of humanity. And yet their anger, their sense of resentment, their desire to punish, their sense of themselves as having suffered terribly, or at least being in a long line of women who suffered, and therefore the suffering of men now is perfectly justified to them. I find it that really frightens me, actually. That there are so few voices, because it's actually, it isn't true. When people say I'm brave and all of that, I'm really not, because as a woman, we have a great deal of latitude to be able to speak out about these issues. And so there are thousands of women in these positions of power who could dissent And yeah, they would, there'd be some anger, but they can do it. They are not risking their reputations or their careers to dissent.
Yeah.
And yet they don't.
No, that's right. Now I want to talk about your book, Sons of Feminism, which came about as a result of, like, as I do, you receiving thousands of stories from people about what's happening to them, and you decide to put together a whole collection of, and you put the call out for people to write about what it's been like living in this feminized world, and it was swamped with stories.
Yeah.
I just want to talk about some of the ones. I mean, I really recommend this book. I think it's got some fantastic stories capturing what's happening out there, which is quite terrifying. But I want to just mention a few of the stories that really struck me, moved me. Particularly, I always think the one, I think, was an Indian family where the father ends up committing suicide, and the son, the adult son, writes about the fact he now feels he was complicit in the family's rejection of him.
The father attempted suicide, and fortunately he was not successful. He didn't actually commit suicide. That wasn't maybe entirely clear in the essay, actually, but that is one of the most poignant and powerful essays in the collection, out of a collection of 26 incredibly powerful essays. But yes, he came to that realization that, without even realizing it, he'd taken his mother and sister's side against his father. And once he came to rethink, he could understand his father's sense of powerlessness actually in that family, knocking himself out. His father was a highly credentialed surgeon who was worked extremely hard, knocked himself out doing 70-hour weeks or something tremendous, caring so much about his patients and developing new techniques for patient care and all of this. And when he would come home, he would encounter an angry wife and a rebellious daughter screaming at him, expressing their resentment and their dissatisfaction with him. And the son's realization that this is something that he now is having to enter into is it's very, very powerful. That his sense that men like him, high achieving men, very cerebral men, often have a great deal of trouble communicating with women, and they get into these situations where society in general tends to feel so much more sympathy for the woman and to see the man as privileged and entitled, when in fact he's doing everything he can for his family and getting very little in the way of recognition or thanks for it.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think struck me the most, all of the stories, is that what I was most surprised by really was the lack of bitterness on the part of so many of these men and their continued willingness to work things out, both on a social level and on a personal level. The deepest desire of, I think, every single man who wrote in that book, and the overwhelming majority of those who have written me, their deepest desire is to have good relations with women, to have, many of course want a sexual partnership. They have so much love to give.
Yeah,
and they've been told for all their lives in some cases that there's something wrong with them, that their sex is responsible for everything that's bad in the world, that they harm women, merely by desiring them, merely by looking at them. I mean, it's just such a talk about toxic. It's a real toxic message. And yet it hasn't actually warped their natures. They want to work things out. They want to just call it quits. Let's just end the gender war and figure out a way that we can talk to one another and go forward in a partnership. And I do not find that when I speak to mixed groups. I do not find that amongst women as a whole. I find a lot of resentment on the part of women. I will give a talk, spend 40 minutes talking about all the ways that young men are being harmed now. Talk about suicide rates, talk about divorce, talk about men who are alienated from their children. And a woman will stand up at the end and say, 30 years ago, a man put his hand on my thigh in the workplace and told me I should stay at home and have children. You know, and she's still angry about some trivial thing that happened 30 years ago, and she can't hear any of what I'm talking about, and she couldn't care less. She feels it's deserved. And so the thing that I find so remarkable, and I guess the reason for hope maybe, is that there are so many men who still want to work things out and who are full of love. And it was the thing that most surprised me, because what I learned as a feminist is that men hate women. Yeah. And men see women as the other, and that they have disgust for women. And it soon became apparent, as soon as I actually started talking to men, they don't have disgust for women. They care about women. They want to protect them. They want to make women happy. They want to, you know, find a way that we can all live productive lives. They don't have that resentment and that sense of grievance.
Although I think they should. I mean, yeah. I agree with you about that. And I mean, I've had all these years working, for instance, with the whole issue of sexual design, relationships, of men who have every reason to be totally furious at being endlessly rejected in their marriages and treated really badly. And yet they're still just yearning for effect, and many of them still love their wives even in the face of that rejection. I mean, in your book, the nerdy young men who go through, have men right in their, I think, 30s and 40s who've had no sex at all in there because they've just been too intimidated by the rules women setting up about how the hazardous business of approaching women, and the fact that if they get it wrong, they could be hung out to dry. I mean, one of them that really struck me was a young man who falls for a girl and tries to approach her, makes a CD of his, you know, what songs he thinks she would like, and he ends up being accused of harassment. That was a terrible case, wasn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard from so many men like that. Yes, it's such a poignant story. It was clearly a case where he was not getting, well, I don't even know what it was a case of on her part, but it seems like she was not able to say to him that she wasn't interested. And so he thought that he was pursuing a romantic relationship, taking his time. He was a very shy, very sensitive, very brainy young man. And so, yes, he went to her home, which I guess she was surprised by, and he gave her some CDs, and then he wanted to talk about them later, and he tried to arrange a number of meetings on campus. There was no sexual assault. There was nothing aggressive in his behavior whatsoever, but she went and told a counselor that he'd made her feel uncomfortable. And then after that, a whole machinery, you know, started into motion that, you know, and I don't know whether she could have stopped it, but she didn't stop it at that point. They had a hearing. He tried to defend himself. He was eventually expelled from his college as a result merely of her saying that she had been made to feel uncomfortable. And yeah, I think he's the one that begins his talk saying that he's never hugged anyone, he's never kissed anyone. He's too terrified. Every time he thinks of approaching someone now, and he's well into his 30s with a professional career and somebody who has a lot to offer and really wants to love someone and have a family, every time he thinks of it, he's just terrified. Yeah. And so you multiply that, you know, to the power of 10, and that's what we're doing to young men. And so I'm always surprised, you know, when you do meet somebody who is really, really seething with anger, it's not surprising to me at all. And in fact, it is astounding that many more men are not.
Yeah. Now we're going to finally meet up, Janice, at the conference, ICMI 19 in Chicago in August, which I'm very excited about. So I'm looking forward to that. What are your plans? I noticed you're about to retire from the university. And what will you do then?
I really just want to keep on doing what I'm doing. You know, what you mentioned, how I was inundated with the stories when I put out the call for Sons of Feminism. I have enough stories still for a number of further volumes. And so a huge project that remains is to figure out how to get those stories out there. And that could basically be a life project. It's quite something. I want to keep on making videos, certainly. I never feel that I run out of subject. As we both know, that the culture seems to be getting crazier rather than less crazy. And so there are many, many more things to talk about.
Janice, I think we're going to have to stop. Yeah, but it's been really great talking to you today. And I know we have there are a lot of people who are following my work and your work, so I think they'll enjoy seeing us together. And I really look forward to actually being able to meet you later this year.
Yes, I'm really looking forward. Yeah, and if anybody out there hasn't got their ticket yet, they should consider ICMI Chicago. It's going to be a great time.
It is. Thanks very much, Janice.
Thank you.
I hope many Australians will be joining us in Chicago in August for the International Conference on Men's Issues, ICMI 19. You'll be able to meet us and also all sorts of leading lights in the men's rights movement, like Karen Strawn and Diana Davison, Carl Benjamin, who's Saigon of Akkad, Paul Elam, and many others. The link is going to be listed below this video in the low bar. Please use the code Bettina sent me. Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.